Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. We're going to take a break from revolutionary ideas, having reached Lenin and Trotsky, but we will be coming back. There are plenty of 20th and 21st century revolutionary ideas to talk about. But this podcast is also about using the history of ideas, the ideas of the past, to make sense of the present and the future. So we're going to do a short 6-part series on the history of ideas of globalisation. All of these episodes, I hope, are going to say something about what's going on today with Trump, not just Trump, but with the global economy. We're starting with a conversation with the economic historian Marc Palen, who specialises in ideas of the global economy of the 19th century, to talk about that period of globalisation: empire, race, free trade, protection, and what it's got to do with Donald Trump. Mark, we're going to be trying to tell in this series a history of ideas of globalization. And my guess is you could probably take that story back a long, long way. There has been a global economy of a kind way before the 19th century, but we're going to start in the middle of the 19th century because there is probably, I think, a coherent story that can be told from then to now. So I'd like you to sort of set the scene for us in the middle of the 19th century, in the aftermath of the repeal of the Corn Laws in the UK, so we can say a little bit about what that involved. But how would you characterize in the middle of the 19th century the idea of there even being a possible global economy? Were we anywhere near the notion that the world formed an economy in its own right?
I think with the focus on the economic dimensions of globalization, we start to see in the mid-19th century the formation of what we would now think of as modern globalization, in ways that, obviously the extent and the scale has been sped up quite a bit in the decades since, the internet and things like this. But these kind of developments of these tools of globalization, these new technological and communications marvels that come into being in the mid-19th century, of course, the overturning of the Corn Laws in Britain in 1846 ushers in this almost a century of British free trade advocacy that's really important to this story. But I think it's made feasible, at least in the minds of some of its adherents, most of its adherents, because of these new tools of globalization. You have steamship lines now that are shrinking the world drastically. By the 1860s, you have all these kind of the 1860s in particular, I'd say, is a really remarkable moment here with the laying of the transatlantic telegraph, the completion of the transcontinental railway in the United States, the opening of the Suez Canal, and similar developments that come along in the decades after that really tie together the world in ways that we find more familiar in 2025 than people would have in 1825.
So does that mean that 1846, the repeal of the Corn Laws, which, as you say, sort of starts, at least from the British perspective, a century of advocating for a version of this, the free trade version of this. But that was a bit of a leap in the dark, in that the technologies that you're talking about come a little bit later. So the 1860s in particular starts to turbocharge this. In 1846, when the Corn Laws were repealed, and we'll tell people a little bit about what that involves. Some people will have done it at school, many people won't have, and even the ones like me who did it at school find it hard sometimes to remember. But let's explain what happened. But also I'm really interested in the question of whether the people who really championed free trade in the 1840s had a vision of what was to come, or was this a leap in the dark, or was it about something else? Was it actually not about a conception of a global economy? Was it about something very different?
You can trace these advocacies and ideas of the 1840s that inspire this turn to free trade in Britain. You can trace these back to what some of us call kind of the beginnings of the long 19th century. This theorization that's beginning with, say, like Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, which is published in 1776. Ostensibly, it's to kind of take into account and make sense of this burgeoning British industrialization project that's happening, as well as the crisis in the American colonies. But it's actually in that context of the American colonies and how Adam Smith is thinking about how to reconcile these differences that he starts conceptualizing ideas of globalization that are going to be really important for mid-19th century theorists and advocates. And that is his one idea, which is to let the colonies go and continue to trade with them as peaceful, friendly allies. And that's going to be very important to this conception of peaceful free trade through non-coercive means that some free traders will take up in the 1840s. But he also, really fascinatingly, had a theoretical way of reviving the British Empire and revolutionizing the British Empire in many ways through this idea of imperial federation and imperial parliament that he thought would be a theoretical solution to this too, giving the colonists a proper say in parliamentary debates would have been another way to do this. But he said there's no way we can do this because the British Empire is too disparate. It's too separated. And so what you're going to see, though, with these new tools of globalization that come into being in the mid-19th century, it's also going to revitalize this other Smithian idea of a federated imperial world economy with the British Empire at the heart of it, which is going to influence subsequent debates within the British Empire itself in the late 19th century, these competing visions of Adam Smith's own ideas of trade and the future of empires. So I think the ideas are there, but they become something much more salient and practical by the time we get to the 1840s. Even before the 1860s developments, I think steamship lines and cables and so forth are already starting to do their job and sparking this imagination of a much more globalized universal vision of the world order. This is what inspires the Anti-Corn Law League in Britain, this kind of middle-class grassroots pressure group to try to overturn these protective tariffs on foreign grain in Britain, right? This is in part because Britain is rapidly industrializing, way more than its rivals at this time. But this is also meaning a great amount of urbanization. And so you have a lot of workers living in British metropoles that are quite poor and starving. And so one of the ways that the Anti-Corn Law League is able to tap into this issue is to say, why don't we get rid of the protective tariffs on foreign grain, on food? That way we can have cheap food flooding into England from all over the world, and we can make sure that everybody can afford to put food on the table, the so-called sheep loaf. And so this connection between industrialization and food security is a really important element here that's, I think, taking into account this globalized world that's coming into being as global food market system even that's coming into existence. And then, of course, some of those leading advocates of this free trade movement will also start drawing on the potential foreign policy implications of a free trade world, right? So drawing more on that pacifistic element that Adam Smith was touching on there, that you can create friends out of enemies through trade relationships, what we now call capitalist peace theory. This idea that the more closely you trade with one another, the less likely you are to go to war with one another. And the easier it is to get things that you need, even if you can't produce them yourselves, right? And so this taking early 19th century ideas of comparative advantage and actually thinking that this could be applied to the globe, not just to a particular region. And so this is what's happening in the 1840s. And it's this really fascinating connection between domestic reform, food security, and taking into account industrialization, as well as this foreign policy implication of potentially a much freer, more integrated world order.
When the people who wanted to repeal the Corn Laws imagined this free trading economy in which grain would be cheaper, did they think of it in global terms? Did they think of it primarily this stuff was going to come from Europe and the United States? Did they think it would be trading between friends in the sense that there were certain kinds of relationships which would likely foster and be fostered by this new openness? Or did they genuinely have a vision, we'll just find out the cheapest places we can import this from and get it from there? Because the world is a big place and there are lots of places you can get grain from. How global was it?
They were certainly limited to an extent by the kind of racialized 19th century ideas that were at play here. In a sense, though, this has never truly been an issue of real contention. I mean, if you think of like the 20th century, you had the first, second, and third worlds. You had the developed and underdeveloped and undeveloped worlds. The idea that the world can have different levels of hierarchies and even racialized hierarchies can still exist within a global vision, especially if you adopting this idea of comparative advantage and every country producing what it does best. I think in this 19th century vision, that really meant Euro-America was the center of this world order that they envisioned. That's where the industrialization was going to happen. And then the rest of the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, I think presumably would continue to be raw material producing areas to funnel into these industrializing core. So there's a Euro-American centric element to, I think, all of these visions of the 19th century. But that didn't mean that it wasn't necessarily universalistic. I mean, you even have some within the kind of Christian internationalist ideas of the who tap into this free trade movement in the 1840s, who envision this, finally the world can operate in an economic system as God intended it. There's a reason why God had put all of these different materials in all sorts of different parts of the world. It's because we are meant to share these ultimately if we can finally get to that point. And so there's this millenarian spirit that also taps into this that I think is very global to a certain extent. But there are these racial blinders, I think, that do limit the extent of this vision.
And presumably in that millenarian vision, the food can move globally, but so can Christianity. I mean, it's missionary true, right? So the idea is you lock everyone into a global economy, you also lock them into a global economy of ideas. And in the global economy of ideas, the true ones will win out. And if you're a Christian, that means Christianity.
Absolutely. And of course, that ties into this idea of this being the 19th century being a period of what some call imperial globalization. And that is that it's not just empires that are moving this kind of spread of interdependence and movement of people and capital and ideas, but they are the main vehicles at this time. And of course, so the missionary impulse will also think about how to take advantage of these imperial networks to spread Christianity and in that sense spread civilization, quote unquote, as they would have thought of it, and essentially try to recreate the world as a kind of Christian Anglo-Saxon order based on these principles coming out of Britain.
So I want to talk a bit more about that story in a moment, but just on the question of that 1840s reform, the reformers, as reformers do, would have made the case that it was win-win. Food's going to get cheaper, workers in the city aren't going to starve, industry will prosper. Yes, we will also be enriching people in other parts of the world, but we will all get richer. But it's not just win-win. There are costs. People understood very well some of the costs, including the people who were the diehard defenders of the Corn Laws. Among the losers were going to be the British aristocracy. Their economic and indeed political authority would be shaken by this, but also agriculture, traditional ways of farming the land, the idea that Britain was primarily an agricultural rather than an industrial or manufacturing nation. And these transitions are not costless and they're not seamless either. I mean, the politics was brutal around this. How did people think about the costs and how did they think about ameliorating for those costs? Or was this simply a price that had to be paid? Sometimes reformers simply say the price of progress is progress and it'll come out in the wash. But the politics of it was so raw, as it is now, and we're going to make some comparisons with now. This is not just highfalutin abstract argument about economic theory. This is people's lives and livelihoods, and the winners lived alongside the losers. How did, in the 1840s and 1850s and beyond, people navigate that?
I guess it kind of taps into these questions of nowadays of outsourcing and certain manufacturers perhaps picking up shop and going somewhere else in a more globalized system and then taking advantage of cheaper labor and this sort of thing that we have nowadays. I mean, there was some of that, although I think your point about the aristocracy is really useful here, and that is that by and large, I think the free traders in Britain, they were rather successful in framing this as a middle class and to a certain extent working class movement to undermine the influence of the aristocratic elites who owned most of the land, who were making money on these protective tariffs on foreign grain, for example, even though that was being paid for by the working classes when they went to go buy their loaves of bread. So for them, they were able to say, look, if we get rid of this protective tariffs on foreign grain, we can undermine the economic power of the aristocratic landed elites. Of course, the aristocratic landed elites are also the ones always advocating for wars and for an expansion of empires. And so if we can undermine their power, then we can undermine their influence over foreign policy making, which would democratize British foreign policy making, which would usher in a possibility for manhood or even universal suffrage. And so for them, the way that they were able to connect free trade with this panacea of democratization, cheap food, prosperity, even job growth, right? I think considering that the British were the leading industrial power, the idea, of course, would be that more of these jobs that would be created would probably be happening within these industrial centers rather than out in the British farms. But thinking about the fact that the aristocrats were the ones that owned most of that land that was being used for farming made that less of an issue in Britain, at least, than it might be in other parts of the world.
Is it possible to say that free trade in this period, in the middle of the 19th century, was a populist cause? Because we are now living in an age where tariffs are the cause of the populists. I mean, it's more complicated than that, and there are lots of variations on this theme. But as you describe it, if you go back 175 years, free trade is the slogan, the banner, the organizing principle of the people who are claiming to stand up for ordinary people against elites, to stand up for the workers against the people who are exploiting or gouging the workers. Is it too much to call that a form of populism?
It was by and large a middle class movement. And they attempted to, and to some degrees were successful in getting the working class, drawing out this kind of populist dimension to it. I think in some degrees quite successfully in Britain. It's not to say that all of the working classes got behind this project, but ultimately this promise of the cheap loaf would be quite tantalizing to an extent that it would continue to be a rallying cry to get the working classes to support free trade policies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Well, relatively unique in that sense to the British in this context. But so elements of populism, certainly designs on populism, but this was by and large a middle-class intellectual movement. But I mean, it does start getting into some really interesting working-class politics too. I mean, if we think about where this was centered, where the ideas of this free trade movement were centered, Manchester, England being the main center of this. This is why we call sometimes these ideas around free trade and peace and anti-imperialism Manchester liberalism, or the Manchester School, or else named after the leader of the Anti-Corn Law League, Richard Cobden, the so-called apostle of free trade. We call it Cobdenism. There's a reason why these are happening in these metropoles like Manchester. And it's really fascinating to note that this is largely a kind of center-left liberal radical movement of the middle classes. But I think it's an underappreciated moment here, too, when these liberal radical capitalist ideas about free trade start percolating and I think influencing Marxist internationalism at the same exact time that this is all happening, too. So, yeah, the fact that Frederick Engels is living in Manchester, England in the early 1840s, and Karl Marx joins him soon thereafter in the 1840s. And that's exactly when Marx and Engels start developing their endorsement, or at least halfway endorsement of free trade as the next small p progressive step in capitalist development, getting us closer to the socialist revolution. It's more than coincidental that these are enunciated in the 1840s while they're living in Britain during this free trade agitation. So again, this is still influencing more intellectual circles, middle-class intellectual circles, but with important connotations for a more populist idea that could come out of that. And so yeah, the Marx and Engels endorsement of free trade. Marx gives this speech in 1848 on free trade. Of course, lots is going on in 1848, as your listeners well know if they've been listening to your previous episodes. So maybe this gets overshadowed, but I think it's really important to this story that Marx comes out in 1848 saying that we socialists and nationalists all should be supporters of free trade because this is where capitalism needs to go. Protectionism, mercantilism is regressive, it's retrograde, it's slowing down capitalist development. Free trade speeds up capitalist development. It also has the added bonus of uniting the workers of the world through market integration, which is going to be key for Socialist International. And actually, the condemnation that Marx and Engels have for the protectionists is remarkably similar to the Manchester School in their connection with protectionism as a sort of violent tool of coercion that ultimately works against the country practicing it, I think, in many ways. In other words, there's a really interesting kind of alliance that you can almost see starting to happening in the 1840s in an intellectual level, at least, around these ideas of free trade and globalization as they try to tap into this populist dimension.
As you say, England, Britain is an outlier in this period. So if you're Marx, if you're Engels, if you're a Cobdenite, Britain is leading the way in something, and they'll probably have a different view of where it's ultimately going to end up. But it's not as if the rest of the world just followed suit. Right? Britain undertook these reforms in a world which, I don't know whether almost universally, but widely retained tariffs, including on agricultural product, including in continental Europe, including in the United States. Were there people in Britain worried that Britain was going to end up exposed to be a free trading nation in a world of protection? And this does have some echoes with what's going on now, the idea that actually free trade is all very well and good, but only if everyone plays by the rules. And if we're playing by the rules and the rest of the world isn't, we're going to end up the losers. Was there that anxiety, or was Britain sufficiently, I don't know, self-confident as a nation at this point to be beyond or above that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. And one is, I think, how we tend to get taught about 19th century globalization when we actually do get taught about it. I know when I was going through school, even at university level, if you did actually get classes on mid to late 19th century American foreign economic policy, for example, it was often portrayed as an era of the Gilded Age, so-called in the late 19th century, as an era of free trade and laissez-faire run amok. And this, as you just pointed out, is quite it's quite the opposite that's happening in the United States. And I think part of this is because we tend to exaggerate the hegemonic influence of the British Empire in the 19th century. And because of its revolutionary unilateral turn to free trade in 1846, we tend to assume that because they wanted the rest of the world to follow in its free trade tracks, that's what happened. And this is a remarkable misconception of the decades leading up to the First World War. And as folks continue to misremember the arguments of people like Norman Angell, warning about the perils of the globalized world and what conflicts would mean, these are all, I think, connected to this misconception. So yeah, to your point, the unilateral turn to free trade, they assumed that people would see the prosperity wrought from this free trade turn and want to get on board with it. And that did seem like it was happening for a brief period. So the mid-19th century, from around 1846 to around 1870, things do seem to be going the free traders' way. So you have the 1860 Cobden-Chevalier Treaty or Anglo-French Treaty that's signed, using arguments to say, why instead of preparing for another military conflict with the French, why don't we just try to trade with them instead and try to do this peaceably? And this is what Richard Cobden is able to work out with his French counterparts, and what many consider to be the beginning of this kind of most favored nation treaty system. So what happens is, the French and the British sign this treaty, and it starts lowering trade barriers between the two countries. And a variety of other Western European states also look at this and they say, hey, we'd like to get involved in that. And so there's, for a brief moment, it seems like this free trade momentum is really picking up steam. But then, this is all going to change drastically by the time we get to the early 1870s. There's a long depression that strikes in 1873, a global depression. And as we've seen in our own time since, say, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the tendency to turn inwards, to look out for self-sufficiency, is a very common kind of knee-jerk reaction that nations take during times of economic crisis. And this is what's going to happen in a very big way in the late 19th century as one rival of the British Empire after another, rather than embracing free trade, embraces the exact opposite, protectionism, to protect their infant industries. So from around the early 1870s on, you start seeing how the German, American, French, Russian, eventually the Japanese empires will all start turning to the economic nationalist policies rather than economic cosmopolitan policies.
And the Prussian case is interesting. So Cobden and the Anglo-French Treaty, here's a signal for the rest of the world of what's possible. A depression begins in 1873, but in 1871, the French get crushed by the Prussian state. And the Prussian state, as I understand it, never embraced that idea. The Prussian economy had a strong protectionist streak running through it. Is that right? Including in agriculture. The German economy was in part German. Prussian economy was in part founded on an idea of protection.
This does get into the juxtaposition of is European integration this massive free trade arrangement, or is it the world's largest protectionist bloc? I think you could make a similar case for the Prussian and ultimately the German Zollverein idea. There are interesting ideas of free trade mingling in there with getting rid of trade barriers between various German states, but also there is ultimately this very, very big tariff wall that's also assumed to be placed against the rest to protect German agriculture, to protect industry. And in interesting ways, too, the German case, especially when we get into the late 19th century, starts to look, at least from the kind of free trade radicals within Germany, the German imperial government, as it becomes more protectionist, they start to see these connections with the aristocratic landed elites in Germany as very similar to what was going on in 1840s Britain. So this is the Junkers, the militant aristocrats of Germany who control all the land and who are advocates of protectionism. And so it's really interesting to see how a few decades later, free traders in Germany try to do something similar as what the free traders in Britain did along very similar lines of argument. Obviously less successfully, to your point about the Prussians sticking to protectionism for most of this period.
And that point you make is really interesting. So you can look at these things always in a way from two different angles. The German Zollverein, this customs union, within it, they're free traders. The barriers are down. Goods are going to pass easily across what could otherwise be borders or barriers. But from the outside, it looks highly protectionist. Did people think that a similar story could be told of the British Empire too, that this case for a kind of global free trade vision was really, as you were suggesting earlier, an imperial vision? And within that imperial vision, actually it's heading towards not global free trade, but what was going to come to be known as imperial preference. And the idea, yeah, we're all in favor of this free exchange of goods across borders, but round the edges of our world is another world, and we're not nearly so keen on opening up to that. Going back to what you said about Adam Smith and these two different ways of thinking about where this is heading, one, a kind of grand British imperial version of the global order, the other, a much more raw free trading version.
That's a really interesting one. And of course, it does depend on time and place, as always with these things. I'd say one way to come at this is that I've been talking mostly about the liberal radicals in Britain who led the overturning of the Corn Laws, who were the lead advocates of free trade, the Manchester liberals. But there are others who get on board this free trade gravy train in Britain who are much less opposed to the British imperial project. And so you have these liberal imperialists, you have the Palmerstons and the John Bowerings and the Opium Wars, people advocating for this coercive advancement of free trade to speed this process along, even if it means going against the will of various nations and turning them into colonies. So forcibly pushing free trade onto some colonies in the British Empire, like the Indian colonists and the Irish colonists, but granting tariff autonomy eventually across the 19th century to a variety of white settler colonies that were deemed to be more civilized and able to take on this responsibility of their own economic affairs, at least, if not their foreign policy affairs. And so this is an interesting way. So you have the real and perceived dangers represented by Britain's turn to free trade, this fear of British free trade imperialism, whether it was going to be quite explicit and direct in some context, or for the cases of the German protectionists or the American protectionists, the Republican Party mainly is the party of protectionism from the 1850s onwards. They are very paranoid of British free trade machinations, even the more peaceful ones, because they assume this is how the British are going to try to dominate the world. They're the more industrially advanced economy. They're going to try to force us to open up our markets and to essentially strangle our infant industries in the cradle through free trade policies and turn us into informal colonies. So that is one fear that is being had, and it's going to be developed in very effective ways in these political circles to oppose British free trade ideas across the late 19th century. But you also see, and I think this is an important connection here, understanding how Britain's imperial rivals are turning to high tariffs and trade wars. This is going to turn some within Britain against the free trade system itself. So you start to have this kind of minority undercurrent, especially amongst conservative circles. Again, free trade tends to be a liberal political policy in this period, and protectionism a conservative one. So conservatives in Britain are increasingly becoming more critical of the free trade system. They want to retaliate against Britain's enemies. At first, this is referred to as fair trade, in contrast to free trade, or later during the Edwardian period, the tariff reform movement of Joseph Chamberlain that's going to pick this up in a big way. And so this is where you start to get the early stirrings of this alternative vision, not of a British free trade system, but of imperial trade preference. And it's exacerbated by the fact that when Australia, Canada, when they're given tariff autonomy, it's really striking what they do. Do they choose to go the free trade path as given to them by the British themselves, or do they go a different way? It's the American system of protectionism of the Republican Party that becomes the policy that even Britain's own settler colonies seek to emulate. So what does Canada do when it gets tariff autonomy? It starts raising its tariff walls. What does Australia do when it finally federates and has its control over its own tariffs in the late 19th century? It starts creating tariff walls and also unilaterally giving preference to British goods. So that movement towards British imperial preference is happening mostly within conservative circles, within these protectionist circles. But that's not necessarily the vision that the British free traders themselves had for the empire or for the world. And again, so I think that's where sometimes the coercive implementation in places like India and Ireland are useful here, but also just the wider idea that this would be a free trading system that the empire. And so that's where you have the Adam Smith's kind of two visions playing out in really interesting ways here too. In many ways, Adam Smith turns into an advocate of protectionism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In really fascinating ways, they try to say that, you know who would have supported this imperial trade preference system? Adam Smith. You guys have forgotten about his theory of imperial federation and imperial parliamentary system. And in many ways, in his defense of the Navigation Acts and so forth, that Adam Smith would have been more of a protectionist if he could live in the late 19th century protectionist order that we find ourselves in, not a free trader. So it is really remarkable how those ideas get reinterpreted and revived in various ways because of the increasingly economic nationalist imperial order that's coming into existence from the 1870s onward.
And when that starts to happen, then you've got another clear tension, that's probably not even strong enough word, in the free trade vision. Because as you said, in its purer mid-19th century form, this is a vision of peace, right? It's about trade, not war. And it's about trade, not coercion. And yet you've described a world and an empire, the British Empire, which through the second half of the 19th century, free trade is spread by force. And when they do the peaceable version, the democratic version, which is to say to people in Australia or Canada, we're not going to impose anything on you. We're not going to insist on anything. We're going to give you a choice. They don't choose free trade. They choose tariffs and protection. So it's almost like the whole thing's been turned on its head. Free trade is the thing that requires, and force here means military force. You mentioned the Opium Wars. These are wars, right? Wars of free trade. The peaceful version, the one where people are given a free choice, leads to tariffs. So it's as though that mid-19th century vision has been completely inverted or even exploded.
Certainly repudiated. And this is going to lead to a gradual kind of deterioration, I think, within the free trade system itself because of the lack of demonstrable examples they can point to. I think they're as surprised as everybody else that the world, when given the choice, chooses protectionism over free trade. And of course, for the pacifists who are connected to this movement, the ensuing trade wars, colonial expansionism, the scramble for Africa, the dividing up of China in the late 19th century, the Boer Wars, so many of these, the Spanish-American War, we can go on and on with the list of these conflicts that proliferate and the colonial expansion that happens. For them, this is all an unfortunate consequence of the fact that the majority of the world decided not to follow the free trade path. And even within the empire itself, it seems like it's going that way.
So it's not the fault of free trade, it's the fault of the people who didn't see the light.
Yeah, and I think this goes to this wider tension that encompasses all this as well as much of the 20th and, as we're saying, the 21st century, this contestation between nationalism and internationalism that's playing out in an economic way here that we're discussing, but that has wider implications for political nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And I think in many ways the story here is of the 19th century fight over free trade and protectionism as the nationalists winning the day, with the connotations and repercussions that come with that, a dog-eat-dog world of winner-take-all kind of mentality of seeing the world, and tariff conflicts instead of, as free traders would have liked to see, cooperative and peaceful exchange of goods. So the nationalists win the day. And that is, I think, one of the takeaways here is that they underestimated the power of nationalism, much as I think the globalists predicting the end of the nation state in the 1990s underestimated the power of nationalism in such a big way, too.
To what extent in the 19th century is it, so it's clearly nationalism, it's a form of nationalism we can recognize, but it is so bound up with ideas of empire. So when we think about Australia, Canada in this period, I don't know, maybe it's a failure of my historical imagination, but it feels like calling it, say, Australian nationalism in the context of this empire, it doesn't quite tally with what I think of as nationalism in the 21st century, because it is so overlain also with ideas of race, of whiteness, of the British Empire, and belonging to these other groupings which make the Australian position possible, the nationalist position possible. So it's clearly not a globalisation position, but it is the Australian nation within these wider circles of the white world, the British world, the Anglophone world, the English-speaking world, in which there will be this kind of trading. But then there's a wider world, and that's the thing that is absolutely being kept out. Is that fair, or do you think, or am I misrepresenting the extent to which this actually just really is nationalism. It's not imperialism, it's not racism, it's not.
I think you're right. And I think it's a puzzle that historians have been trying to solve for quite a long time, is this really interesting relationship within the British Empire, at least in the late 19th century, of what nationalism looked like in places like Canada and Australia. And you're absolutely right. At least some conceptions of that nationalism being closely tied to the empire itself. And so, yeah, imperial nationalism is a really remarkable area here. And that mostly falls within the conservative parties in those colonies. Not entirely. Of course, the liberals will try to argue that their conception of free trade and loosening the bonds perhaps within the empire is the proper nationalist path. It's not to say that there's a monopoly on nationalism here, but it does take us into those interesting kind of racialized understandings of imperial trade preference. It is striking that India and, of course, Ireland also not being considered a civilized part of the empire at this point, along interesting racialized 19th century lines, that Ireland and India are in many ways treated the same, whereas Canada and Australia are treated very differently. I'm not sure it's all that different from at least certain conceptions of where we go from here. I'm thinking of something that's still rather salient, or at least it's sticking around. When Britain left the EU, one of the more provocative and I think popular visions by those who were in favor of Brexit was CANZUK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. And I think that was going to be the new trade agreement, which is very reminiscent of the British imperial trade preference system that's coming to existence by the time we get to 1900. And it's a very racialized one at that, right? Why Canada, Australia, and New Zealand only, the so-called white settler colonies that are being envisioned as part of this. So I think there maybe are some more similarities to this kind of racialized conceptions of imperial nationalism of the late 19th century and our current moment than some might give credence to.
Because it is interesting that, another vision that came out from Brexit by no means was the one that all Brexiteers were in favour of, and some of them were horrified by it. But the idea that Britain could become, as it was sometimes called, Singapore on Thames, that there's another version which is in a way much closer to a more global vision, and even that association is suggestive of something. But it also is so redolent of the empire. It's a different part of the British imperial story, because Singapore is a big part of the British imperial story, but the trading outpost, and somehow that Britain had to restore its ability to be open to the world in that way. But also there was that understanding of a kind of global Britain. That phrase was also used too in the aftermath of Brexit. And at the end of the 19th century, in an imperial setting, I don't think people talked about a global Britain, but they did talk about a greater Britain, as though the greater Britain could almost extend anywhere. Is that fair to say, that there were at least some people who started to think maybe what we need to do is not open this British economy, this society up to the world, but sort of expand it to encompass the world? Did it come close to being global, or was it just greater in the sense that it kind of went from Australia to Canada and back again?
It's interesting to think about global Britain versus Greater Britain. And of course, a lot of the conceptions of Greater Britain were very, very racialized even then. The idea of Greater Britain in the 1880s still very much understood as, like you said, an Anglo-Saxon white settler colonial project encompassing the globe in that sense, rather than bringing the global economy into the British imperial sphere. And of course, I suppose tied to a lot of this too is the question of immigration. This was always an issue with the global Britain folks too. And again, maybe that's why some of them were okay with CANZUK, because that also usually came hand in hand with the idea of free immigration between these states that would form part of this CANZUK agreement. But that's also often, as we saw with the EU now, or say with the UK's attempts to establish a free trade agreement with India, usually this entails having some sort of relaxation of immigration policies that those advocates of global Britain were by and large not willing to make. And so there's that question of immigration, that either an expansion of British immigration abroad or the problems of allowing for greater immigration into the Britain and its empire that I think you're right are very important parts of this. But it depends on the time and place. I hate to do that. The Australia's white policy towards immigration and these kinds of things versus today are in many ways quite different. But the parallels are striking as the differences, I think.
By the time this story gets to the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, as you say, in some respects, free trade is in retreat. Protection barriers are going up. The British Empire is one of a number of empires that are competing globally. So this is a global contest. But these empires are increasingly powerful, and that includes the United States, which is maybe not in its own mind, but in other people's minds, starting to look like an empire too. And yet, in the history books, if you Google when did globalization start, you will be told the first phase of globalization ran from 1870. So you said a bit earlier, 1870 is when it starts to turn against free trade. But the conventional story is it ran from 1870 through probably to the First World War. And then maybe you'll get an example of sort of Keynes or someone talking nostalgically about that globalized world that was lost with the First World War, that world where ideas and goods and people were able to move freely around the place. So these two stories feel to me like they're really at odds with each other. The golden age of globalization at the end of the 19th century and the age of imperial contest and protection at the end of the 19th century. So are they at odds with each other? Which one is true?
That idea of this golden age of free trade and laissez-faire that culminates for some reason with World War I is the common one. But when you really dig into the story of economic globalization and imperial expansion in the late 19th, early 20th century, or if you dig into how did the most diehard left-wing free traders of this period see the world order, or indeed how did the protectionists, the economic nationalist advocates of imperialism and colonial expansion of this period, how did they understand the world? They did not understand this as a world of free trade and free immigration. This was a time of increasingly stringent immigration restrictions. Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s in the United States, kind of emblematic of this, as well as the White Australia policy that follows. But both the critics of this imperial protectionist system and its advocates understood it to be an imperial protectionist system, despite the fact that the world was becoming more protectionist. Trade flows were increasing, but that's because of these new tools of transportation and communications, right? Steamship lines, the transatlantic cable, and so forth were drastically dropping the cost of transportation costs, right? And this was allowing for trade to increase despite this movement. So I think it's that confusion of seeing how trade flows are increasing and then assuming that it must have been the golden age of globalization is, I think, where we lead to a lot of these misunderstandings about, and including a lot of the theories surrounding how ultimately this ends with a global war and the First World War. And I think it makes a lot more sense to understand it as an era of economic nationalism, with trade wars laying the economic foundations for geopolitical conflicts that culminate into various colonial aggrandizements and ultimately of the empires turning upon one another. I find that to be much more persuasive, and it makes a lot more sense than, for some reason, this golden age of globalization culminated in the First World War. This economic nationalist story makes a lot more sense for piecing this out. I think the internationalists that were opposed to it and the nationalists who supported this system would have, I think, agreed with that.
And are there therefore parallels with how future historians might look back over the period that we have been living through? Because there is a temptation to want to say things are either one thing or another thing. This is either the golden age of globalization or, come the First World War, this is where it all falls apart. But it's both. I mean, two things are happening at once. In history, always more than one thing is happening at the same time. So on the one hand, in that period, the technology meant that trade barriers were coming down, simply practical barriers in the way of moving goods cheaply around the world. It becomes possible to transport grain without the grain rotting. It becomes possible to do it at a cost, which means you can make a profit even if it travels halfway around the globe. We've been living through a period where all sorts of costs to trade have come down, and some of it is still to do with shipping. The people who believe that how things are packaged on giant tankers is the key development of recent trade, but also obviously because of information technology and the internet. So we've got a sort of similar story. We've got a shipping story and we've got a telegraph story. It's just our telegraph is called the internet. And so we want to say this must be the golden age of globalization because all the barriers are coming down in a practical way. And at the same time, the politics is telling a very different story. And these two things, they coexist because that's sort of how history works. Of course they coexist. And yet we affect shock and horror that we thought it was the golden age of globalization and, oh, look, it's coming to an end. It feels to me like it could at least be a little similar to the story that you just described, the 1870 to 1914 story, which is historians affect a kind of past the smelling salts horror. We thought it was globalization and now here they all are fighting each other. But if you think it's two things at once, it's not so surprising. Does that make sense for a way of thinking about now?
I definitely think that also applies to how we've understood or misunderstood Cold War globalization. After 1945, you have all these new institutions, multilateral structures, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 47. Again, commonly taught as this idea of American-led free trade hegemony and globalism and a reordering of the world to avoid this economic nationalist order, not just of the 1920s and 30s, I would argue, but of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and so forth. But I think the realities of the Cold War globalization tells a very different story, and it is much more of a story of this contestation between economic nationalism and economic cosmopolitanism in ways that don't fit that simple narrative of post-1945 Western free trade hegemony ruling the day. Maybe it made a little bit more sense, but in many ways, I think the end of the Cold War, the so-called neoliberal moment of around 1999 to, I guess, 2016, I think we are now seeing an attempt by the United States, and largely successful, it seems like, in the near term at least, to create this protectionist imperial order that has a lot more of a reflection of the late 19th century than it does of the 1990s, early 2000s. So to what extent are we going to look back, future historians, at the neoliberal moment of that 25-ish year span as the unusual exception, I think, to what is ultimately an economic nationalist rule that we seem to be moving into very drastically now.
And when the economic nationalists tell the story of that period, and actually of the Cold War period too in the Trump version, the story that is told is that it was a scam, it was a sham, it was a rip-off. It presented itself to the world as free trade, everyone's a winner. Actually, what it was were certain people ripping off the system and taking advantage of the most powerful player. Are there parallels to that in the late 19th century story too? So as Britain starts to get increasingly anxious about the free trade world that it may have brought into being, was some of that anxiety the feeling that actually what it was an opportunity for Britain to be, for want of a better phrase, ripped off under the auspices of a free trade order? I mean, that's a huge part of Trump's rhetoric now, isn't it? I mean, we have to be clear. That is a big part of what he thinks we're meant to believe. He's always believed that, almost since he was a child, that the post-Second World world is just an opportunity for people to take advantage of the most powerful player, the United States. Did people in Britain have similar anxieties?
It was certainly a growing critique. I mean, Joseph Chamberlain is a really good case in point here of somebody who began as a liberal politician and a free trader, but famously also mayor of Birmingham, and seeing how the rival protectionist industrial powers have caught up and are even overtaking the British in certain areas, that is part of the reason why he shifts to an imperial trade preferential vision for the empire and retaliation, tariff retaliation. This is certainly happening in the late 19th century towards the tail end for somebody like him. I mean, you can see it. I guess the thing here, though, is that we have the president of the most powerful country in the world who is advocating for these economic nationalist policies. In the late 19th century in Britain itself, there was a minority current within conservative circles in particular that were espousing similar kind of paranoid critiques of the demise of British labor and industry. But they were the minority current. I mean, not to say that they weren't uninfluential. I mean, and of course, there's really interesting connections with what's going on there and the way that they're actually drawing on their understanding of the economic nationalist makeup of the world order.
There are two ways that people might argue the free trade system is a kind of scam and a means for at least some people to exploit the system. One of which is people who are less developed, less advanced, to say it's all very well for Britain to talk about free trade, but Britain is already the dominant player in this system, and we need protection in order to be able to compete on a free trade playing field. We're going to get screwed if we don't at least protect our infant industries. The United States did it at the birth of the United States story. South Korea did it. You see it happening over and over again. And so there's an idea that the trouble with pure free trade advocacy is it's much easier to do it if you are already a lot further down the road of development than if you're at an earlier stage. And if you're at an earlier stage, you need protection in order to be able to compete. But then you reach the point, as you described, 1885 in Britain, where because that case has been made, the dominant player gets paranoid and thinks, oh, the system is a rip-off for us because they're free riding on the system with their protection and we're still doing free trade and we're going to end up as the losers. And you can see something like that happening now in the case of the United States. I mean, you could say there's a parallel story there, which is During the heroic period of globalization, the 1990s and beyond, a lot of the less developed economies said, well, it's all very well for you to talk about globalization, but actually we need protection to compete in a global world. But now the paranoid actor, the one who's saying it's not fair, is the dominant actor, because the dominant actor is saying they've all been doing this while we've been the good guys, no more the good guys anymore. I mean, I know it's more complicated than that, but there is a really interesting echo of the late 19th century and the British story in the American story.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are some interesting, at least rhetorical parallels and ideological parallels, if not the actual global economic order resembling the way that Trump would suggest it is. And of course, the way that they came up with the idea of what the tariff levels were from various countries has nothing to do with tariffs at all. Again, tariffs by and large are the lowest they've ever been across the globe. And I think that's one of the many kind of unusual elements of what Trump is doing, one of the many unusual ones of trying to bring back this age of tariff wars and protectionism. You even see this in the ways that now you have U.S. businesses seeking exemption from the tariffs, whereas if you go back to the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States, it was companies trying to get tariffs placed on foreign competitors to protect themselves, right? So it's the policies and ideas being articulated by the Trump administration, I think you're absolutely are much more fitting for a 19th century economic order than it is for 2025. That doesn't seem to be stopping them at the moment, though. These connections between the Trump administration and the late 19th century have become quite explicit. Trump is very frequently drawing on the late 19th century as his inspiration. In his mind, he wants to go back to this period of the McKinley Tariff. He talks about William McKinley all the time. His favorite words, reciprocity and tariffs. I mean, the Republican Party's motto from 1892 on for quite some time was reciprocity and protection. These went hand in hand. Bilateral trade through reciprocity alongside protectionism for home industries was the Republican mantra that Trump seems to be explicitly drawing on. And his love affair with the 1890s and the McKinley Tariff, interestingly, the tail end of this long depression, this 1890 tariff that's put into place, the highest at that point in American history by then Republican Congressman William McKinley, the Napoleon of protectionism, as he had the nickname, raised tariff levels to an extreme degree. It also started including this reciprocity policy that the Republican administration of Benjamin Harrison could then use to establish bilateral trade agreements that were quite exclusive. Again, this gets to this idea of a more contained, regionalized vision of globalization that these protectionist imperial powers like the United States envisioned that were being implemented in a big way because of this revolutionary McKinley tariff that Trump seems to love. And interestingly enough, William McKinley and then Secretary of State James G. Blaine, they realized, or at least they thought, they could use the McKinley tariff to annex Canada. So, in fact, James G. Blaine has this private correspondence with President Benjamin Harrison, which he says, I think, ultimately, by raising these high tariffs against Canada, we're going to force them to want to become an American state. And quite the opposite happens, of course. So the 1890 McKinley tariff leads to much of the Canadian federal elections revolving around whether or not they would tie their coattails, trade coattails to the United States or to the British Empire, with the Conservatives winning out, which meant high tariff walls along the U.S. border and closer ties with the British Empire through British imperial trade preference. And so it would take another 100 years before we have Canadian-American free trade come into existence. And so this is the moment. I mean, Trump even referenced a speech by Teddy Roosevelt not too long before the Panama Canal becomes another expansionist goal of the Roosevelt administration, where he says reciprocity is the handmaiden of protectionism. This came up in a speech that Trump gave during his first term, and I knew exactly what that was from. That was from a speech that Teddy Roosevelt gave when he was calling for the informal economic conquest, if you will, of Cuba, which was not technically an American colony, unlike Puerto Rico at this time. And so forcing Cuba to accept this reciprocity agreement was a key part of this plan. And the idea here, too, is if Cuba didn't accept this reciprocal bilateral trade agreement, that the United States would colonize Cuba formally. This is the speech that Donald Trump is drawing on. And as we see his ideas about annexing Canada, we see his ideas about retaking the Panama Canal, this is just... it is straight out. If you want to understand the methods of Trump's tariff and imperial madness, I think the best thing you could do is go back to this 1890s, early 1900s blueprint that the Republican Party has laid out for us.
And we're speaking just before another Canadian election. And Don't know what's going to happen, but I'm guessing the story might repeat itself in that it doesn't look like the people of Canada are going to vote to be annexed by the United States. And indeed, they are going to re-elect someone who, even a few months ago, might plausibly have been described as a globalist, Marc Palen, as a Canada First Prime Minister.
That's right. It's just the political parties themselves might have flipped around a bit. Now it's the Liberals who are doing this instead of the Conservatives. But it is, again, another really interesting reflection, at least, of the late 1890s economic nationalist moment. Yeah.
A reminder that the second part of my conversation with Edward Acton, historian of Russia, about Lenin and Trotsky and what happened to them and their ideas after 1917, is available now as a bonus episode on PPF+. To get that and all of our bonus episodes, it's very simple. Just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. And if you do go to our website, you can see all of the bonus episodes that will be available for you as soon as you sign up, including all of the bonuses that we put out to accompany the Revolutionary Ideas series. Episodes with Agnes Callard on Socrates, on Calvin, Chris Clark, on 1848, me talking about King Donald I, more from Adam Rutherford on Darwin, more from me on the Futurist Manifesto. It's £5 a month or £50 for the year, and there's a year's worth of bonus episodes available for you there already. Next time on our series on the history of ideas of globalisation, I'm going to be talking to PPF regular, our guide to the history of British democratic politics, Robert Saunders, about something that Marc Palen touched on in today's episode. The story of Joseph Chamberlain, who at the beginning of the 20th century in Britain tried to turn tariffs into a great popular democratic cause. We're going to be talking about what he attempted and the reasons why he failed. There are lessons for today. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.